What are respiratory substrates? These are food substances which are oxidized to release energy. They come in three main different forms, namely carbohydrates. Carbohydrates such as polysaccharides and disaccharides are first digested into monosaccharides and then converted into glucose. Upon oxidation, 1 gram of carbohydrate would yield 17 kilojoules of energy. Carbohydrates are richly found in food substances such as sweet potatoes, wheat products such as bread, scones and all the others, Irish potatoes, and cereals such as maize, rice, wheat, and all the other cereals. Lipids, on the other hand, when oxidized, they tend to release a lot more energy than carbohydrates, such that 1 gram would yield 38 kilojoules of energy. But lipids are only oxidized when carbohydrate reserves have been depleted. The lipid is split into fatty acid and glycerol by the enzyme lipase. Then the glycerol is converted into pyruvic acid. The glycerol may also be converted into glycogen for storage. The fatty acid undergoes a series of reactions to form molecules that will eventually be converted into acetyl coenzyme A that enters the mitochondrion of the Krebs cycle. Now, despite the fact that lipids release a lot more energy, but they're not the preferred substrates, respiration substrate, because their breaking down involves a longer process and requires more oxygen. And the more the oxygen that is used up, the more the metabolic water that is released. So lipids are not the preferred sources of energy. They're only used after the carbohydrates have been depleted, because the breaking down of carbohydrates is faster and requires less oxygen. Sources of the lipids include dairy products such as butter, fruits such as avocado, and many nuts such as groundnuts, cashew nuts, macadamia nuts, and so on. Then proteins are the other respiratory substrates. Proteins are respired only in extreme cases where fats and carbohydrates have been exhausted, that is, during prolonged starvation. And the sources of proteins include eggs, poultry, fish, beef, groundnuts, and beans. The proteins are first hydrolyzed by proteases into polypeptides, then acted upon by peptidases and broken down into amino acids. The amino acids are then deaminated in the liver. The products of deamination are urea and a carbohydrate intermediate, which is converted into pyruvic acid. The pyruvic acid is then oxidized to release energy. Now you can see, obviously, to break down protein and obtain energy, there are many processes involved with the production of the toxic urea. So obviously, this is the reason why proteins are not the preferred. They are the source of energy of the last resort in the body. Even though compared to carbohydrates, 1 gram of proteins produces 22 kilojoules of energy, which is still higher than the 17 kilojoules for the carbohydrates. But the advantage of the carbohydrates is that there are very, very few, or the products are not as toxic. The carbon dioxide is not as toxic as the urea that is produced in the metabolism of proteins to release energy. Now next look at the respiratory quotient. The respiratory quotient is the ratio of the volume of carbon dioxide produced divided by the volume of oxygen consumed. In other words, it is the ratio of volume of carbon dioxide to the volume of oxygen per unit time by a respiring organism. That is the ratio of volume of carbon dioxide produced to the volume of oxygen consumed per unit time by a respiring organism. For example, when an organism is respiring or breaking down glucose, you can calculate the respiratory quotient from the formula. 6 molecules of oxygen are used and 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. So using this formula, you find that RQ is equal to 6 carbon dioxide divided by 6 oxygen, which gives us 1.0. Lipids generally will tend to give an RQ of 0.7 and proteins an RQ of 0.9. Now, why is the calculation of RQ important? Because one, it shows us the type of substrate being respired. From the values you can tell whether it is a carbohydrate, whether it is a lipid, or whether it is a protein. The second reason why RQ is important is that it shows the type of respiration taking place. If it is anaerobic, there will be no oxygen involved, and so the value is going to be much greater than 1. It will be greater than 1. So if you get an RQ that is greater than 1, then you know that that is anaerobic respiration. Now, apart from anaerobic respiration, there are certain metabolic activities that will also affect the value, so that the value is greater than 1. And this would also may distort the use of RQ. Because in a living organism, we rarely get these exact figures. In fact, the value that you obtained is maybe 0.85, showing that at any one given time, it's a combination of these substrates that are being respired. Or it could be just carbohydrate, but because of the certain metabolic processes that involve the use of CO2, like for example, conversion of carbohydrates into fat, then this will also affect the true value of the RQ. It is, however, not possible to know exactly the specific type of food being respired, as I mentioned, because at any one given time, it will be a combination of the various type of substrates that are being broken down. Now, related to that, you can list the factors that affect the rate of RQ, factors that affect the RQ. One is the type of respiration, as mentioned. If it is anaerobic, then the value is going to be very high. The other is the type of food substrate. You judge that from the values. Carbohydrates is 1.0, lipids 0.7, and protein, we get a value of 0.9. Then there are those certain metabolic processes, like conversion of carbohydrates into fats, that will also affect the rate of respiration and also the type of products, because there are certain reactions that consume carbon dioxide. So the value obtained is going to be much smaller than should actually be the case. So these are the factors that affect RQ in an organism. The type of respiration. Anaerobic will give a very high value because there's no oxygen. Food substrates, again, depending on the amount of oxygen consumed, you're going to get different RQ values. And then there are certain metabolic processes that go on in a cell that consume some of the products, especially carbon dioxide, and thereby affecting the rate of, or the RQ.